Let's get into Chapter 3 with managing legal risks. Again, what we see here is we're going to start the chapter with a good example, and we're going to later, toward the conclusion of the chapter, we're going to come back to it. In this particular case, we're dealing with a mining company out of northern Manitoba that's extracting ore, nickel mining, nickel ore, 3,000 tons per day from underground mines. And if we're talking about that, then we're also talking about the extraction process, the environmental effects, what happens as far as the ability to export the nickel to other countries, whether or not you get involved in other countries and try to expand your mining operations to those other countries, which could involve a ton of other issues, especially when you consider it not just international treaties, but even tax law gets into it. So what we see about is the owner of this mining company is going to hire somebody to assess the legal risks, to be able to come up with a risk management plan and what it's going to have to involve. Because it has to be comprehensive, it has to be complete. It has to consider all possible issues that could arise, including the issues that I just mentioned. You have to assess the legal environment, page 46. You have to determine what will reduce the likelihood and impact of any mistakes that would otherwise be costly, because you're hiring lawyers like me, and to try to determine how much in damages you could be the subject of. Distracting in terms of your time and effort. These types of mistakes could really... I have one client right now who's been dealing with CRA for, I'm not kidding you, has been dealing with CRA for approximately a dozen years on various cases. Every single time that he gets past one hurdle with them, they pursue him in another direction. With regard to other returns. Has that taken up his time and his energy? Absolutely. Harmful in terms of relationships and your reputation in the industry. In this day and age, it's not as if everything is by word of mouth. If something goes wrong, it's up online, isn't it? You know that. You may go onto this website called Rate My Professor. All right, and I'm sure some of you have heard of Rate My Professor. I've been teaching now since 2003. I'm on Rate My Professor. I can't stand Rate My Professor. Don't get me wrong, from my understanding, my reviews are pretty darn good. But if they weren't, or if somebody had a bone to pick with me, don't you think that that would negatively impact me? Look at an application called Yelp. And some of you may have been on Yelp before. Yelp is a wonderful, wonderful device, because if you haven't been someplace, normally a restaurant, you can go onto Yelp, you can look up what the user ratings are on Yelp. If somebody doesn't have good ratings, or if somebody's being targeted by one or more people who say, this place sucks, doesn't it impact that restaurant's reputation? Isn't there a certain risk involved in that? What can be done to try to minimize that risk or the damage to reputation? That's what comes up when we're dealing with legal risk management. You'll see that the plan is actually defined further down on page 46, and then we apply on page 47, we start to, the four-step process. We have to identify the legal risks. Toward the bottom of page 47, we have to assess the organization's functional areas. We have to review the organization's business decisions. We have to examine its business relationships. And we have to analyze the organization's operations and transactions. That's not easy, guys. It's not as simple just to, hang up a sign and say, hey, guess what? I'm in business. It's far more detailed. Speak to any business person. Running a business is hard work. Because not only do you have to account for what you do, or the service or the goods that you provide to others, but you have to take into consideration everything that deals with people who step onto your property. You have to address how your employees are handling affairs, and what procedures they're subject to and what you're going to do in case an employee makes a mistake or does something that's just completely wrong and they know it. I mean, these are things that you have to assess. Marketing and sales are going to be something that may come into it as well. How you market and how you sell things is important. We talked about that with business ethics. How are you going to be able to sell your product and do so without overstepping? We're going back into the mining example. We see marketing and sales toward the bottom of page 47. On to page 48, we talk about production. And again, we touch on what I mentioned at the very beginning of this chapter, environmental legislation or civil actions. Mining can create quite a mess. That's oversimplifying everything that mining can do and impact the environment. And it's not just impact that can be seen. It's stuff that might involve what's being released into the air. It might involve the overall impact on the ecosystem itself. Does it upset a particular habitat for plants and animals? Does the dust that results from mining activities, does it impact the employees of the mining activities? Does it impact the people who live in the immediate vicinity of the mining activities? You have to take into consideration the actual stuff that's being mined. Is this dangerous? In what form might it be dangerous? This is something that you have to consider. How do you minimize the risk associated with that? We get into human resources, just touched on it. What happens if you have workers who are being subjected to a situation where it's unsafe? Coal mines down in West Virginia. You always hear about these coal mining disasters. What's being done to try to protect those workers from being subjected to real harm? These are issues that you're going to have to take into account. Finance and accounting. What are your business relationships if you take it a loan? What are your relationships with the government, especially when you're paying taxes? Are you paying all of your sales tax? Are you paying the right amount of payroll tax? What impact is that ultimately going to have upon you? These are things that you're going to have to consider. And again, it goes back once again to the mining example on pages 48 and 49. Before we go further, bottom of page 48 deals with the risks and costs of breaching privacy. Say that you have a database and you have customers who come on and purchase products. What are you doing to protect their privacy? If they're putting in credit card numbers, if they're putting in personal information, what safeguards are you putting in to make certain that their private, confidential, personal, and financial information does not get into the wrong hands? And we've seen over the past several years various data breaches. They're becoming more common with large companies such as Target, such as Home Depot. Heck, even government databases are now being tapped. We just heard about in the United States how hundreds of thousands of former and current federal employees who worked for the U.S. government, that their private information had been lifted by people outside the country, and all of that data was compromised. Heck, even at my old university, anybody who's previously worked at that university over a 20-year period, my old university's data systems were hacked. My private confidential information was hacked in. Does that create a lot of concern for me? You better believe it. When they get certain confidential information, including a social insurance number, when they get certain information with regard to bank account records in the cases of direct deposit, you better believe that there are serious concerns, not just for the individuals, but for the company that failed to put up proper data security to minimize any chance of that risk and to keep it updated. And the costs associated with that, especially here in Canada with the federal rules and regulations that regulate a law called PIPEDA, P-I-P-E-D-A, can be serious. If you don't believe me, ask anybody here at St. Mary's. Going into step 2, evaluating the risks. You have to assess the probability of loss and you have to assess the severity of loss. Now again, you have to make these assessments and how much risk, but at what point does risk enter into an ethical or moral, become an ethical or moral priority? At what point does risk take a back seat to what's morally correct or what's ethically correct? Give you another example, okay? Back in the 1970s, we used to have a car that was made by the Ford Motor Company called the Pinto. All right, Pinto was a cute vehicle, it was a popular vehicle. Everybody liked the Pinto, you know, except Ford. I forgot to tell the people about one defect about the Pinto. It would sort of explode, all right? And so Ford apparently knew about this defect and did nothing to advise the people, the consumer public, about this defect. And the thing is, Ford did just what we've been discussing, evaluating risks. They assessed the probability of loss and the severity of loss. Ford came to the conclusion that they were going to stand to make more profit off of withholding that information than by disclosing that information. If they had to remove all the vehicles from the road for fear of explosion, they were going to lose a lot of money. And so they decided that it was far more effective to cross their fingers and hope that only a certain number would actually explode, and then they would pay out settlements to various individuals. They would profit off the Pinto, despite the fact that it was deadly and destructive. But yet in a normal context, evaluate what those risks are, and always make sure that there is an ethical, a moral edge to how you decide these things. In step 3, devising a risk management plan, you're trying to determine how to avoid or eliminate, or at the very least reduce risk, transfer risk, or retain the risk if you want to be able to regulate that risk, try to minimize that risk through whatever processes that you can put into place. So you'll see discussion with regard to risk avoidance, risk reduction, and then on to page 54, risk transference, shifting the risk to someone else through a contract. I don't want to do this directly. You know what? It's far better for us to subcontract that out to somebody else. Let them worry about the overall risk. There's still a danger of liability. But yet, if you can avoid the direct process, then you're hopefully trying to shift some of that risk away so that you wouldn't be held, hopefully, not directly liable. There is still a risk that you could be sued if something goes wrong. And then risk retention, all right, absorbing the loss if the legal risk materializes. And in risk retention, toward the bottom of page 54, you're going to see, well, when you retain risk, what do you try to do? You try to absorb it by getting insurance, whether it's self-insurance or whether you find an insurance company that will issue you a policy where you simply pay the deductibles, or something involving non-insurance, where an organization can charge losses as an expense item. Along the lines of what we saw with my discussion of the Ford Pinto, you'll see a more recent example from the past few years involving General Motors and faulty ignition switches. That's on page 55. Please read it. Did General Motors do the right thing? No, it did not. Finally, step 4, implementing the plan. How do you carry out the plan? How do you monitor and revise the plan? Because once you have a plan, you can't say, okay, here is the plan. The plan is everything. The plan is perfect. We never have to depart from the plan. We never have to modify it, change that plan. The plan is perfect. Well, that's not true, is it? Of course you're going to have to change a plan. Your business is going to continue to evolve. The way in which you do business is going to change. The risks that are involved could very well change. Ask somebody who was doing business 30 or 40 years ago how their sense of risk has evolved in the computer age. They'll tell you that everything has changed. Doing business even as a lawyer, things have definitely changed. The risks that are involved with me doing business today are far different than when I got started 21 years ago. So I have to continuously modify and tinker with my own risk management plan. I'm trying to avoid risk, and me avoiding risk may involve some of the same things that I was doing 21 years ago. Trying to take as good a care of my clients as I can, trying to do the best job I can to protect their interests. But there are other things that I'm going to need to do as well. I'm emailing them, for instance. Am I taking proper steps with email security to make certain that the communications, the messages that I send back and forth, are being protected from somebody else coming in and taking that? That's just one example, but certainly my practice has changed over the years. So you'll see the figure 3.2 on page 57 and the legal risk management model summary. Please review that. And then you'll see on figure 3.3 Northland Mining's legal risk management plan. Take a look at it, guys. Is it comprehensive? You know what? It's on one page. It gives a summary of what it is. Does this help them to assess all the risks that may occur? Maybe. I'm sure that there's probably something that they left out. Doing this is something that's a work in progress, as I just said. There are going to be aspects that they're eventually likely going to have to add to that, depending upon changing conditions. The next section, and I'm just going to breeze through it right away. When do you hire a lawyer? Number one, if you don't know what you're doing. And number two, when you may know what you're doing, but you just don't simply have time to do it, and you want a professional looking out after you. The legal risk management plans, you can't tell me that Northland Mining and its president, Alex, actually understand all the issues in that risk management plan. It's impossible. How do you choose a lawyer and how do you choose a law firm are based on a number of factors that are discussed on page 61. I'll tell you this, you get what you pay for, all right? Don't automatically go with the cheapest lawyer. But also keep things in context. One of the cases I dealt with recently, a small business hires a major law firm to represent it. And I'm representing just an individual against a business. And I'm sitting there thinking, okay, I've charged a fair fee to my clients. That small company doesn't know what it's about to get hit with as far as legal fees, because I have a sense for how much that law firm overworked the case. They're going to get a major bill. And if they lose later on down the line to me, then they're also going to have to pay damages. You have to do your own risk management with regard to how much you're going to pay a lawyer and whether it's worthwhile. All right, we get to the very end of the chapter, page 62, 63. We go back to Northland. They ask 3 key questions. Please review those carefully. Followed by the chapter summary and then to our chapter study.